Long after the guns of the Second World War fell silent, the soldiers who had beaten him could not stop talking about him. British officers studied his campaigns. American generals kept his book on their shelves. And in the middle of the war itself, standing before the House of Commons, Winston Churchill called him, across the havoc of war, a great general. That kind of respect is almost never paid to an enemy. But there was one commander the Allies feared in a way they feared no other. His name was Erwin Rommel, and to the men who chased him across 2 continents and never quite caught him, he was the desert fox. Although he was almost always outnumbered, almost always short of fuel, and almost always fighting with someone else's leftovers, he humiliated larger and better supplied armies again and again, and more than once captured entire fortresses full of men with a force a fraction of their size. But what exactly set him apart from all the other generals? Let's take a closer look at Rommel's 3 greatest tactical moves, from a young lieutenant in the mountains of Italy to a field marshal at the gates of Egypt. In October of 1917, the war on the Italian front had settled into a bloody stalemate high in the mountains along the Isonzo River. For more than 2 years, Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies had bled each other white over the same frozen ridgelines, gaining almost nothing. Then, in what became known as the Battle of Caporetto, a combined German and Austro-Hungarian force tried something new. And among the mountain troops leading the assault was a 25-year-old lieutenant of the Württemberg Mountain Battalion, a man the Italians had never heard of and would never forget. The Italians held the high ground, and they held it in the old way, arranged to meet a frontal attack, layer upon layer of trenches and machine gun nests staring down the slopes. It never occurred to them that the danger might come from behind, that a position lower down the mountain could be threatened before it had even been attacked from the front. Rommel saw the gaps between those positions the way a burglar sees an unlocked window. Rather than throw his handful of men at the guns head-on, he slipped between and behind the Italian strongpoints, climbing through wooded draws where no one was watching, appearing suddenly in the rear of men who thought the fighting was still far in front of them. And here he did something that would define his entire career. Whenever a body of Italians was cornered, Rommel made a point of separating their officers from the ranks and demanding their surrender before anyone had time to count how few Germans there actually were. By the time the Italians realized that a whole regiment was throwing down its rifles to a few dozen mountain troops, it was already too late to change their minds. Had those men grasped their true numbers and turned on him, his tiny detachment could have been wiped out in minutes. Instead, entire units surrendered at the mere sight of German soldiers behind them. He crossed the line of the assault on the 24th of October and simply did not stop. On the second day, he overran position after position, capturing hundreds of men in the span of minutes and shattering a counterattack. On the 26th, he was ordered to halt and pull back to a lower peak. He ignored the order. As he later wrote, under no circumstances would he give up ground that had been taken with so much skill and blood simply because of alarming reports from the rear. With barely 100 riflemen and a few machine guns, he pressed on toward the summit of Monte Marajour and took it. By late that morning, the mountain was his. In roughly 50 hours of continuous fighting, Rommel's tiny force had climbed and clawed its way forward and captured 9,150 prisoners, including some 150 officers, along with 81 guns. His own losses came to 6 men killed and 30 wounded. That is more than 250 prisoners taken for every single casualty he suffered. For this, a lieutenant, not yet 26 years old, received the Pour le Mérite, the highest honor Imperial Germany could give. Look closely at what he had done, because it was a pattern he would repeat for the rest of his life. Dividing and bypassing his enemy instead of meeting him head-on, leading from the very front to seize the fleeting moment before it passed, and using deception to hide how weak he truly was. These 3 things became the hallmarks of Rommel's art of war. The lieutenant who had taken an army with 150 men would not stay a lieutenant for long, and there is a great deal more of this kind of breakdown for anyone who subscribes, because 23 years later, that same instinct would carry him across a river the French swore no army on earth could force, at the head of a division that would soon disappear from the maps of both sides at once. By May of 1940, Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division, part of the great German gamble to knock France out of the war in a matter of weeks. The plan sent his tanks through the dense forests of the Ardennes, ground the French High Command had written off as impassable to armor toward the Meuse River. The Meuse was the last great natural barrier in his path, and everything depended on getting across it fast. Rommel had only a few days before the French could bring up enough strength to seal the crossings for good. And again, just as the Italians had done in the mountains, the enemy had badly underestimated him. The French did not believe armor could move that quickly through the Ardennes, and so their divisions were still marching toward the river when Rommel's tanks arrived. One French division walked more than 50 miles over 3 straight nights and reached the Meuse exhausted, only to find the Germans already at the water's edge. The first attempt to cross in rubber boats on the morning of the 13th of May was torn apart by French fire from the far bank. Most commanders would have paused. Rommel improvised. He ordered the houses along the river set alight so that a thick curtain of smoke drifted across the water and blinded the French gunners. He brought his tanks right up to the near bank and had them fire directly across the river to pin the defenders down. And a little upstream, his men slipped across at night along an old weir the French had left standing, because destroying it would have lowered the river and exposed their own positions. Rommel did not direct any of this from a comfortable headquarters in the rear. He went down to the river himself and took personal command of one of his rifle battalions in the thick of the crossing. In his own words, he took over personal command of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Rifle Regiment, and for some time directed operations himself. It was the way he always fought at the front, close enough to touch the fear and to feel exactly when the enemy was about to break. Once across, the 7th Panzer became something the world had not seen before. Rommel drove his division forward at a speed that terrified everyone, including his own side. On the 14th of May, his command tank was hit twice and slid helpless down a slope with Rommel inside it, slightly wounded, but unstopped. He overran a French motorized division while it was still refueling. He plunged so deep and so fast that for long stretches nobody knew where he was. His superiors could not locate him. His radio reports went silent for days. The French could never predict where he would appear next, and neither, it turned out, could the German High Command, which grew so frustrated at losing track of him that his men earned a nickname that stuck forever. They called the 7th Panzer the Ghost Division. By the time France surrendered, that Ghost Division had captured more than 97,000 prisoners, along with 458 tanks and armored vehicles, hundreds of guns, and thousands of trucks. It had done all of this at a cost of around 2,500 casualties of its own. He had bagged admirals, a corps commander, and 4 divisional commanders, and driven from the German border almost to the coast of Spain. He had crossed a river no one thought he could cross, and vanished into a legend of his own making. But the campaign that would truly make his name was still ahead of him, in a place with no rivers and no forests at all, where the ground was nothing but sand, and the summers reached temperatures that could kill a man. As the war spread south into the deserts of North Africa, Erwin Rommel was about to become the Desert Fox. By the spring of 1942, the war in North Africa had come down to a single line drawn across the Libyan desert. The British called it the Gazala Line, a belt of minefields and fortified boxes running some 50 miles south from the Mediterranean coast into the open desert, anchored at its far end by a strong point called Bir Hakeim. Behind that line sat the fortress port of Tobruk, and behind Tobruk lay the road to Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the whole British position in the Middle East. Both armies were preparing to attack. On the 26th of May, Rommel struck first. By now the British knew exactly who they were dealing with, and it frightened them. That February, the British Commander-in-Chief, Claude Auchinleck, had been so alarmed by his own soldiers' dread of Rommel that he sent out a written order to his generals. He warned that Rommel was becoming a kind of magician or bogeyman to the troops, insisted that he was not a Superman, and ordered them to stop talking about him as if he were. And yet, when the battle came, the British commander in the field still could not quite believe how dangerous Rommel was, and it would cost him everything. Rommel's plan was pure audacity. While a noisy holding attack fixed British attention in the north, He took his entire striking force, the German Afrika Korps and 2 Italian divisions, and swung it in a great arc through the open desert around the southern tip of the Gazala line past Bir Hakeim to fall on the British from behind. On the night of the 26th of May, his columns rolled out of the darkness, raising walls of dust, and burst onto the rear of the British armor at dawn. But this time the trap very nearly closed on him. Rommel had not realized how far south the British minefields actually stretched, and his armored fist ended up pinned with its back against those very minefields, running low on fuel, water, and ammunition, cut off from its own supply lines. For a few desperate hours it was Rommel himself who stood on the edge of surrender, and here, once again, he turned catastrophe into a masterpiece. Instead of trying to fight his way back out, he pulled his forces into a tight defensive pocket in the very middle of the British position, a killing ground his men called the Cauldron. He had his engineers lift a path straight through the western edge of the British minefields so that his supply trucks could reach him. And along the rim of that pocket he dug in his deadly 88mm guns. Losing his entire armored force in the middle of the enemy line would have been a disaster from which the Desert War might never have recovered. The British sensed the kill and threw their tanks at the Cauldron to finish him. They drove straight onto the waiting 88s. In a single failed attack on the 5th of June, the British lost roughly 150 tanks. The magician had turned their own trap inside out. It was the kind of thing he had been doing to them since the day he first arrived in Africa, when he had disguised trucks as tanks and mounted them on ordinary cars to make his tiny force look like an army, and dragged brush behind his vehicles to raise dust clouds that suggested divisions which did not exist. With his armor resupplied and the British reeling, Rommel went back onto the attack. The gallant French garrison holding Bir Hakeim was pounded from the air and finally ordered to break out on the night of the 10th of June. Then, on the day the British would remember as Black Saturday, their armored strength simply collapsed, and by the middle of June the British were streaming back in full retreat, leaving the fortress of Tobruk exposed. Through all of it, Rommel was everywhere at once, flying over the battlefield in his little Fieseler Storch spotter plane to read the ground with his own eyes, then racing forward in a captured British command vehicle to direct the guns and untangle his own traffic jams by hand. On the 20th of June, he turned the full weight of his army on Tobruk itself. Dive bombers and artillery hammered the southeastern corner of the perimeter from first light. His infantry and tanks poured through the gap, and by evening they were in the town. The next morning, the 21st of June, the fortress surrendered. In little more than a single day, Rommel had captured around 33,000 men, along with 2,000 tons of precious fuel, 5,000 tons of supplies, and 2,000 vehicles that his perpetually starving army seized like treasure. The entire Gazala battle and the fall of the fortress had cost him only some 3,300 casualties. It was the second largest surrender in the history of the British Army, behind only Singapore. For this, Adolf Hitler made him a field marshal, the youngest in the German army. But Rommel, who never had enough of anything, was unimpressed. He wrote to his wife that he would much rather Hitler had given him one more division than a marshal's baton. Far away in Washington, Winston Churchill was standing beside the American president when the news reached him that Tobruk had fallen. He later called it one of the heaviest blows of the entire war, and said that defeat was one thing, but disgrace was another. So complete was the humiliation that when the British finally did beat Rommel months later at El Alamein, they did it only after gathering an overwhelming advantage in men, tanks, and guns. The commander who would win that battle, Bernard Montgomery, needed a mountain of materiel to do what Rommel had come within a whisker of doing while badly outnumbered. At the gates of Egypt, the young lieutenant from the mountains of Italy had reached the height of his powers. The same three instincts were all there, plain to see. He had divided and bypassed his enemy with the great swing around Bir Hakeim. He had led from the very front in his plane and his command truck, and he had deceived the British at every turn until they walked their tanks straight into his guns. It was, from first to last, the masterpiece of the Desert Fox. What is your favorite tactical move by Rommel? And which commander should I cover next? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoy the content, why not subscribe? See you again soon.